All right, so I guess we'll get started again. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Ryan Cassidy. I am the history and philosophy librarian at Texas Tech University. I'm a lifelong gamer myself. Some of my favorite games include Final Fantasy Tactics, Perfect Dark, and the Legend of Zelda series.
I'm Matt McEniry. I'm a metadata librarian at Texas Tech University. One of my first games was Doom. Loved it to death when I played on 3.1 Windows. Also, my first system was N64, so I loved GoldenEye, Banjo-Tooie, Super Smash Bros. Original. Games like that are really my core. And then I'm also a PC gamer, PC Master Race, etc. Have over 300 games on Steam. I'm a great supporter of college funds around the world.
And what we're really here to talk about today is how video games, specifically focusing on the latest in console hardware technology, have kind of accelerated the need for a better method or more awareness about video game preservation. And I assume most of you in this room, if not all of you, are gamers. And we go out here to the exhibitor floor or to any of these rooms with the games set up, and we see all these great games we like to play and enjoy. And we have to keep in mind is, some of this hardware is already, 20, 30, even older years old. Well, what happens in 10, 20 years from now? Will these games still be available to play? Will they still be there for us to enjoy them? So, before we really dive into it, can I get a quick show of hands? How many of you actually visit a library regularly? Okay, so a few of you. How many of you have ever checked out a video game from a library? So maybe 4 or so. For those of you who maybe don't visit a library too often, I kind of strongly recommend it, whether it's your local public library or if you're a college student, go to your university library. A growing number of library organizations are actually starting to collect video games, and you're able to check them out just as you would a book or a movie, because libraries are finally catching on to how important video games can be to sort of our culture, really. So I normally get asked by academics and even other librarians about why we focus on video games when Matt and I talk about this and when we write about this. And I always go back to, we collect books, we collect movies, music, things like that. But to me, video games are a much more unique experience and a cultural artifact because they are interactive. And part of that is being that no matter what the story of the game is, whether it's the most simple platformer or you're just playing, say, Asteroid, where there's not much more point than don't get blown up, you have a narrative behind the game, not just in the game itself, but also the narrative you bring to it. Maybe you're just trying to de-stress from a certain crisis point in your life. That's your personal narrative. And you're playing the game to work through something or just take your mind off something. It captures that experience. And I feel that video games can really help us work through those certain things. And then we think about the game years later, and we think about the experience it takes us through. And everyone has their own unique experience. Additionally, video games have multiple points of literacy. Of course, you have the language literacy aspect, whether it's text-based games, going all the way back to the MUDs of the older computer generation, or even RPGs now very text-based. You also have the language acquisition skills that can come from that. And I speak from experience. Growing up, I played Legend of Zelda when I was 3. Helped me learn how to read. When I started playing Dragon Warrior, my parents got a little concerned I was putting in Old English because it had very bad Old English mixed into the text. But in a way, it was helping me learn how to, bring these skills into my language memory. So the sensory aspect, of course, the sensory experience, the system experience, especially newer games. You have your HUDs, and you have to learn how the game controls. And if a game is successful, you can kind of hone in on these certain elements of a screen to tell what it wants you to do. Well, you take that same experience, whether you realize it or not, when you work on a a new software package or a new game. That's called system knowledge. You learn how to control a system based on the systems you've used before. And video games really capture all of these different types of literacy. And then I talked a little bit about the self-driven narrative, so I won't talk about too much more here now. But it's not just the game, but it's also the choices you make in the game and how you really play that game. And again, they are one-of-a-kind artifacts because they are so interactive. It's not just a passive skill where you're just reading something or you're just watching a movie or listening to music, which, you know, that does help you visualize things in your mind, but you also have the interactive aspect of video games, which is one of a kind. So I focus mainly on consoles when I talk about this because traditionally they are so proprietary in nature, going all the way back to the classic systems. You have, you know, the Magnavox Odyssey being the first real system in 1972, and then when its success started to take off a little bit more, all these competing electronics companies wanted to get their own product out there. And each product, of course, was only going to play well with their system. So that's what proprietary formatting is. So when you go back to these really, these older game systems and the hardware that is just not around anymore because of the proprietary nature. Even Atari started having some issues with that because the 2600, which is arguably, you know, their most famous console, they kind of started self-cannibalizing with the 5200 and 7800 consoles because some of those were actually able to play the older games. So in a way, people were like, well, all my favorite games are on the 2600. Why do I want the new system? So then the less popular newer ones were kind of falling out of favor before the more classic older one. And then of course with newer consoles driven a lot by technology, being able to create better graphics, hold more system memory, things like that, so they could deliver more experiences. They also bring different unique aspects into how can we preserve these types of things. One thing they talk about a lot, of course, is backwards compatibility, but that's really the exception as not a lot of consoles really offer that. So influences of technology, of course, when you think of, say, the PlayStation 2, which is the most selling console ever, well, what was one of the driving forces behind its popularity? The DVD drive, right? Because that gave you a way of putting this basically brand new media format into your home at about the same price as a standalone DVD player at the time. And then you had all these great games with, you know, Sony having the games that they did. And then that's something they kind of repeated with the PlayStation 3, right? And the Blu-ray drive. Because how many of us are using HD DVDs right now? Exactly. So when we, of course, talk about the new consoles, we're talking about the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and the Wii U. With the PlayStation 4, it so far has sold about 23 million consoles. And as far as why it's accelerating the need of preservation, it's sort of bucked the trend of the PlayStation 2 and even the first generation PlayStation 3s, which offered some backwards compatibility. Well, the PlayStation 4 doesn't really have much of that at all. They do offer their streaming PlayStation Now, I believe, but I've heard it's not a great experience and it's really overpriced for what they do offer. But so it's really just limited. The Xbox One, of course, has just recently announced their plans to introduce some backwards compatibility with Xbox 360 titles. However, it's never going to be complete. And in a way, it's almost like they're personally going to each game to make sure it's going to function, which, you know, that's not going to be something they're going to be focused on 100%. So I know they're doing polls about which games people want to have backwards compatibility with their system, but even then they've said that there's no guarantee about that. The Xbox One, of course, if you remember when it was first announced, that whole debacle really brought about some issues with preserving, because they wanted every game to require an online connection, even if you're going to play, a single player game offline. They were going to require you to load it to their hard drive, which would have not only broken sort of the second-hand market of used games, things like this wouldn't be able to exist, this Expo or anything like that. And this DRM element was so heavily criticized that, eventually people didn't like being told to deal with it, that that whole decision was eventually reversed for the most part. And we go back to what we've sort of had before. They do offer digital downloads of their games, but more importantly, you're not necessarily needing an internet connection all the time for the games that you can just buy on a physical disc. And you can still trade your games and resell them if you need to. So then, of course, we talk about the Wii U, sort of the one left out a little bit. I think so far it's only sold about 10 million consoles, and there's already talk of their new system, of course, coming out soon, the NX. So this sort of seems like Nintendo saying, let's kind of forget about this one. Because the Wii U, in a lot of ways, is kind of stuck in the past. They do offer backwards compatibility. So in that regard, it's kind of nice that you can still play all those awesome Wii games on the Wii U. But they offer a virtual console, which I don't think anyone would say it's really lived up to its expectations. They could really do a lot more. I know people want more, 64 games, GameCube games. That they want the games they want to play on there. And right now with the Wii U, it's just not really possible. The main problem with the Wii U, and when you're talking about preserving content, especially content you've paid for. So right now, if you're on a Wii U and you buy a game from their virtual console, where does that go? It goes to the system. It doesn't go to your account. So something happens to your system, the memory, I don't know, you drop it down the stairs or what have you. It can be really a process to get that back. And I know that's one of the things Nintendo's been heavily criticized for, is that it's not just tied to your account where you can, get a new system later on and download it like you can with almost any other piece of electronics at the moment. So, some of these things are made for business decisions, and it's not always the greatest for gamers, and it's definitely not for preservation of the material, because they're really, they are, and it is a business, but we're also talking about the chance of, real historical artifacts just going away and no one ever remembering them. So some other trends in the industry that affects this. John Anderson of Gamasutra in 2011 sent out a survey to game developers about the steps that they've taken in their companies to really record the preservation of their games, game titles, and just the company itself. And I think of the 61 questionnaires he sent out, he only had 14 respond, first of all, with some of the answers in those 14 admitting completely lost source code of games. So these games that were created and people love, they're gone. So as soon as that last cartridge bites the dust, that's it. No more source code, or you'd have to rebuild the whole thing. Some people were admitting that, and I think this may have been in Sega, that all of the pre-production materials, marketing materials, source codes of some of their famous IPs were just left in boxes. And when they moved buildings one time, they just kind of left them there. So this is historical material just honestly being left behind for someone to do whatever they want with. So what we really call for is just that, the industry needs to learn preservation is good for not only culture and the gamers, but for themselves. Especially now, you take a look at all those HD releases that come out, and it's kind of a joke at this point that there are more of those coming out than new games. But what about those games that we just want to play time and time again? Like we're talking about the original Super Mario, we're talking Mega Man, things like that. Are those going to be available in 10 more years? How will they be available? And so there are some services like the streaming services that allow for that, which the industry, can make some good money off of it if they price it correctly. But more and more, they're just trying to get the new thing out there, obviously to the detriment of preserving material. So more can be done, and we'll talk a little bit more about what is being done. So let's give some examples of some of the lost content. Of course, one of the most recent examples that I'm lamenting is PT. I'm a big Silent Hill fan, and that just looked amazing. I was really stoked about the creative force behind that, and now it's just gone. And not just, you could have downloaded it one day, and the next day it is erased from the store, and if you erase it from your system, it's gone forever. So that's just one example of, that was obviously a really cool playable teaser. It revitalized, I think, a lot of interest in Silent Hill. After a few years of just kind of hitting a lull, people were really excited about it, and now it's just gone. There's even like a guy out there trying to remake it frame for frame. I think that story, I just saw that story a couple days ago. And it is important to point out that sometimes the pooling of content from a game, even after you have it downloaded, is really due to licensing issues. The Marvel games, whether it's Marvel versus Capcom or Deadpool went through this if you played the Deadpool game, there were some licensing issues where the game was available for like 6 months, then it was pulled, and then it's back again. And that's really just content licensing. So you kind of have to ask, well, will I pay for and download this game? Am I going to have access to it 6 months from now, even, let alone 5 years from now? What happens to it? So, got Guitar Hero with DLC songs, and then games that have just become unavailable because of lost code. Things like, I think it was Prince of Persia, Sonic the Hedgehog. So Sega was really bad about their preservation methods. It's just a shame that, we can now have developers go in there and they basically have to rebuild the game from scratch. Just looking at, having an old copy and saying, okay, this is where this goes, this is where this goes, rather than having the actual source code, the blueprints, the developer notes of where these things came from. And even Nintendo for years has said that they try to do the best they can to keep all production materials, whether it's, someone's diary about when they're making a game, because when they look at making a new game in the series, they can go back to this material and still get inspiration from things that were written down 30 years ago. So that's lost content. And then of course, unreleased games. How do we treat those? Things like StarCraft Ghost, if anyone ever waited the 10 years for that thing to finally just die. Mega Man games, kind of notorious. Capcom is not always well loved in that regard. So how do we treat those games? I mean, do we need to try to make an effort to preserve that type of material? These games were talked about for years. They went through so many development iterations. There was art. There were playable demos of these things out there, and now they're just gone. And then on the other side of lost content is changed content. And as a librarian, I'm really all about, privacy and things you own are things you own, except that no longer really applies, especially when we're talking about the landscape of new consoles where you download something and, Sony, Microsoft, or more likely EA, whatever company owns the game, will send out a patch that you have to download, right, to update the game. Well, they're changing content. I'm not just talking about back-end stuff like, maybe fixing the menus so they load faster or something like that. There are real examples of them erasing things in your game that you no longer have. So things like what version of a game, okay, we want to preserve games, right? We think that sounds like a good idea. But what version of a game do we preserve? Do we try to preserve all versions of a game? I know it's not a console game, but think of something like World of Warcraft or any MMO really. There are private servers out there where you can play, it's only vanilla or it's only BC. But if you're talking about a legitimate preservation effort, how do you do that? And then also on games that really rely on the social aspect, especially now, think of like games that are mostly multiplayer, say Destiny, any of the shooters out there now. How do you also preserve the social aspect of that, right? Most of these new consoles rely so much on these social aspects, so you can play with your friends, so you can upload videos. But that also counts as material that if you do have a machine that still plays Destiny 20 years from now and there's no one around to group with, I mean, does that really count as preserving the experience of Destiny or whatever game you prefer? Diablo 3, of course, is also a really good example, especially because the console version is so different from the PC version. And then you look at the PC version and the version out now and how it differs from the release version. I mean, so when you talk about, I play Diablo 3, or I want to preserve Diablo 3, which version? Although most people probably wouldn't say the release version because that was kind of iffy. And we talked about World of Warcraft. And then there are things, there are instances where they've sort of wiped clean content. And, I'm not trying to make it all controversial or anything, but which is better? I'm asking here is, do you sanitize history or do you preserve that infamy to say, yes, this happened, this was something that happened, let's talk about it in historical content. So what I'm talking about here are things like the Madden NFL series, wiping players from the rosters for whatever hijinks they got into in real life. Of course, the NFL is going to get them off of their rosters, the team releases them, things like that. But then the game that you paid for, if for some reason your favorite player was someone who happened to beat his fiancée, that player is no longer available, for good or bad. But from a preservation standpoint, it's like that person was erased from history. And there are many other examples. Call of Duty, a Modern Warfare 2 map, had I believe the situation was there was a painting in a bathroom over a toilet that had references to Allah, and the references themselves were just, Allah is great, things like that. But it was because it was located in a bathroom over a toilet that Activision decided, well, maybe that wasn't the best way to do that. So they actually took the map offline, an entire map offline for a period of time so players could no longer play it. And they eventually did reload it. But there are other examples where things are taken down never to be seen again because of some controversy surrounding it. And that's really still, as someone who's all about preserving history, whether it's good or bad, it's still history. I think Matt was talking to me and reminding me about the point of just recently on the iPhone App Store, all of the games that had the Confederate flag, even ones that were like historical in nature games, were no longer available. I mean, what does that say about society where we have these artifacts that have historical, in a lot of ways, historical significance or say something about a time period, but because of whatever controversy is out there, companies are able to go into your account, your machines, and say, well, we're not going to let this be available anymore. So, yes, sir.
Were there any points to Activision about that map before you found it?
I believe there were. I don't know too much about it, but I believe it began because someone let them know, and I believe it may have been either someone on YouTube or like an online personality saying that, hey, this is weird. There's this, yeah.
YouTube money is big.
Right. So it was something I think that was brought to their attention, and they felt at the time, rather than dealing with the controversy, it might be better to just take the game and scrub it. But it's just the example more of them being able to take the content that, in essence, you had paid for, right? Because also, and I don't know enough about that particular map. If that was, say, part of a DLC package that you had paid for, what happens then? How do you feel about that? and I know it's happened in other instances. So these are all kind of things that we're talking about, and why preservation isn't something that's just a simple topic, and it's something that's being studied, and Matt's going to talk a little bit more about what is being done and what can be done.
I'm amazed he finished that fast, because the last time we did this, he took 40 minutes instead of 25.
I beat him at Smash Brothers. That's why I got more time.
No, we don't talk about that. All right. So I want to say that the digital present is kind of scary in terms of video games and software and whatnot. I study digital preservation. To me, paper is great. You can put paper in a plastic bag in an attic and come back 20 years and still read the paper. You put a hard drive in a plastic bag, come back in an attic, you might not have a computer that can read that hard drive, if the hard drive is even active at all. So I'm going to go through a couple of recent examples from this year, kind of go over why the digital present and why the environment of video games is kind of scary, and then we'll go through a little bit more technical aspects of what some institutions, museums, archives, etc. are doing to help preserve the current gaming culture. So we have, the first example was the ability, there was a new Gears of War leak, and Microsoft was said, okay, you violated the NDA, we're going to brick your Xbox. We're going to make it unusable, we're going to suspend your Xbox Live account, and make it so you can't even play games on your Xbox Live, or your Xbox One. So there's the ability for console producers and providers to just go in remotely and say, you're no longer able to play your game because you violated our terms of service. You couldn't even play offline. It just doesn't work anymore. Then we have digital downloads are able to be taken down. We had the Batman Arkham Knight debacle for the PC. They said, okay, we messed up really badly. This is a port that doesn't work. We're just going to take it offline. We're not going to sell it anymore. You can't play it. PlayStation turns 20 this year. I don't know if you know. There was a forum on Reddit that said, hey, what about disk rot? Has anybody run into disk rot for their PS1 games? That's when certain parts of your disks start to go bad, and so you can't play the game anymore because one section of a line of a CD is missing or is rotting away, and so it won't play the entire game. And there was some discussion about that, and then about, well, go in. E3 announcements this year, big announcements were a Gears of War HD remake and a remastered Dishonored. So you have games that you know and love coming out for current generation consoles that have already come out, but we're going to charge you another $60 or $75 for the same content, just a little bit prettier. We have the United Kingdom that just recently passed or the High Court reverted a CD ripping law. That's kind of gives a blow to migration and libraries that wanted to take stuff from CDs and put it onto a new format. So the UK High Court decided that that was no longer legal, and they reversed that law. EA, a notoriously great company, closed this year Maxis, the creators of SimCity, and other games such as Need for Speed World, FIFA World, Battlefield Heroes, and then you have service rot. Mario Kart Wii a couple years ago went offline because of GameSpy's failure, and several other games were disconnected or otherwise couldn't work because of GameSpy's going down. So what else do we have? We have digital media preservation options, which I'll go through. One of the basic thing is called refreshing. So that's a basic like-to-like transfer, and I like to use the Sony Amiibo dog, or Abo dog, sorry, that was produced in not Amiibo, not yet, 1999, so 16 years old, and Sony refused or stopped producing replacement parts in March of 2014. And now current users are having to cannibalize other dogs for parts for their ABOs if they want to do it themselves. That's basically what's going to start happening to some of these older consoles, is that you go into your NES, your SNES, your Virtual Boy, and you're going to have to start replacing parts yourself or cannibalizing other systems to do it, just to keep it active. Then we have some migration, which is conversion of data to a newer, non-obsolete format. The great example of this is the Internet Archive software library, or their arcade library, to where they've taken these really old games that were on 8-inch and 5-inch floppies and kind of just rip them onto something that you can play in your browser. They have Oregon Trail, Scorched Earth, Tank Wars, whatever you can play. You can play it in your browser, you can stream it. They kind of just did that because either the rights lapsed or they just decided to put it up there because why not? It's kind of a method of preservation, and until somebody says, please don't put Scorched Earth up there, they're going to keep it up there. I met the guy behind Internet Archive, Jason Scott. He's very cavalier, and he just says, we basically just take everything that we can and put it on our servers because it's better to be preserved than wait around for somebody to give me the permission for it to be preserved.
Basically, don't even know who has the rights to that.
Correct, yeah. Games that are ports, that's a type of migration as well. I like to use Batman Arkham Knight, but we can use anything from Diablo 3 or GTA 5. It originally releases on a console and then comes to the computer, and it takes so much longer because people are bad, and that's fine. And then we have YouTube Let's Plays and Twitch streams, which shows how games are played, and people like to watch other people play their games, and that can be used as a record for either offline games or unavailable games. We can look back on that if something is ever deleted. Say, for example, Star Wars Galaxies, and everybody lamented because that's no longer available. So we have the final thing is emulation. And a lot of us probably are familiar with this. We just go online, download a couple of ROMs for Game Boy Advance games. I personally enjoy going through Pokemon at like 100% speed and just blowing through that game. It's a good time waster on a weekend. But that gives me fond memories of when I played it. So we have the capability of hardware or software to replicate the behavior of the different hardware or software. So a good example is kind of like Good Old Games. A lot of their games that you buy will have a sort of emulator like DOSBox that you can replay in their emulated environment. Windows does this. You can compatibility with previous Windows, so they emulate their own operating system on their operating system from previous versions of Windows, so you can play games that maybe don't recognize Windows 8.1 or Windows 10 or 20 or whatever they're calling it now. And they can go back to Windows 7 or 98 or 95 or 3.1. And then you have you have the original data used with a different rendering platform, so like a Dolphin emulator to play your GameCube games. Many levels of emulation, so the technical terms you can have like application formats, computer architecture. Computer architecture uses older software on newer hard drives, such as a Windows on an iOS machine or an iOS. So if I pulled up Windows on an iOS device, that's computer architecture. Application level is using like an e-reader, an overlay to look at objects displayed through other software. An operating system level would be like using Microsoft Office on an Apple hardware. An interface level using like mapping N64 buttons to a Wii controller. So I'm using different inputs, but I'm different like an older input with a newer system. Or like joysticks for Tetris that people play. If anybody saw the Games Done Quick streams that have been going on this past week, a lot of those grandmaster Tetris players will use joysticks and plug into a computer and play it. And then the toughest one, sorry, we don't have that, is environmental level, which is trying to emulate how gamers felt during their time playing a game for the first time or playing a game in an arcade. So if you're playing Tekken in an arcade, how does that make you feel? How do you emulate the feelings that you play, or Primal Rage or whatever, when you're playing with other people, or when you're playing for the first time, or you're actually putting the coins in? So that's a different level. But ultimately, every emulation and every kind of preservation that we try to do is a file format in and of itself, which still needs to be preserved and looked after. ROMs are still files that you can lose easily. I can easily lose a USB drive or another hard drive, or even a cloud server can go down. I mean, nothing in the digital world, unfortunately, is ever preserved indefinitely. So we have some challenges and obstacles to preservation that we know as gamers have in general to our enjoyments. We have DRM. In software, Serious Sam 3 is a good example. If you hack the game and downloaded it from a pirated site, there's this invulnerable pink scorpion that follows you around the entire game, and you can't kill it. And it just bugs you, literally. Then we have hardware, DRM and hardware. Keurig 2.0 tried to put DRM on their K-cups so that nobody else could use their system. That was hacked pretty fast because people really enjoy their Keurig coffee. And then also, but DRM just prevents future digital preservation efforts. If I wanted to go and preserve a game online 10 years from now and I ran into DRM, such as a license code or an authentication code that I had to put in, I can't do that because I might not have that piece of information. And then we come to the DMCA, which is everybody's favorite thing. It's Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and they have many people may see the DMCA takedown notices for YouTube, or that's why Twitch started muting a lot of their audio streams to make it more compliant. Well, they actually have an Anti-Circumvention Act in Section 1201, which prevents you from modding or jailbreaking or putting in any kind of addition to your console so that you could play games or access games in a non-traditional format. And so that kind of puts challenges for preservation on archivists and librarians, and people want to do it legally because we can't legally circumvent the item unless it's obsolete. So obsolete right now is an 8-inch floppy. Because a 5-inch floppy might be used somewhere in the government, and a 3.5-inch floppy is definitely used in the government, because I worked in the government for a little while. So they definitely use that kind of stuff still, and that's not obsolete. And so by the time something is declared obsolete, we hardly ever use it anymore, nor do we have the ability to access that content to actually preserve it. So it's a big hurdle. But there was an exception this year filed by the Electronic Frontier Foundation so that all museums and archives could allow them to circumvent hardware to be able to preserve this stuff. And the ESA, which is the Entertainment Software Association, was like, we don't want you to do this because people will mod it and jailbreak it and play hack games and listen to music for free, God forbid, and all that stuff that's bad. And so there's a bit of a back and forth between lawyers and associations, and it's a mess. But that's one of the big hurdles. And then we have digital content limitations. So we have online only, always online authentication. Some examples of this is like SimCity 4, Diablo 3, anything that has to call home to be able to play, even offline. So if I have to log in to SimCity 4 in 10 years, and I always use like a 10-year window as a good example for when this content might not be available anymore. So in 10 years, I try to play a game of SimCity 4, am I going to be able to? Probably not. It's going to be difficult because that server probably doesn't exist anymore. Like Sims, they used to have a multiplayer. I don't think it's running anymore. Some of the older games, Ultima, are revived, maybe on good old games, but the original servers don't run anymore. So you're going to run into that kind of problem. Cloud processing. I know Titanfall offloads a lot of its processing into the cloud from Microsoft servers using some of the cloud to process some of that gaming. When those servers decide to shut down or die or whatever, does your computer then process it, or does somebody else's server process it? So it's a question of who does that. Subscription-based content, MMOs. If you don't pay the subscription anymore, how are you going to do it? Are we going to preserve like Conan when it came out? I mean, I don't even know where that is. Warhammer, that's gone. A lot of these MMOs that are subscription-based are no longer available to play anymore, just simply because the server shut down, the company said, write off, there's no way to access that content anymore. And then limited license content, a good example of this is Ubisoft's Anno 2070. You had 3 licenses to install this on 3 machines. If I wanted to install it on another machine, I had to call up customer support and get another license key. I can't do that in 10 years because that customer support agency probably isn't around anymore. So how is a museum that wants to legitimately preserve this going to install it? Then, so we have some interesting preservation developments. We have preservation of code, which is functionally the purpose, looking at the purpose of the operation in the software, like how is it operated, how is it built. It's almost like code archaeology. So you're looking at somebody, how did somebody build this code for me? And I like to use the example of a Library of Congress guy from the Moving Images collection received a disc from Sony that was called Duke Nukem Critical Mass PSP. Wasn't released on the PSP. This was original source code that this Library of Congress librarian went in, got a hex editor, kind of pulled out some storylines, some artifacts, some graphics from this unreleased version, and was able to kind of piece together what it was supposed to be about. Not be able to play the game because, of course, you need a compiler for it, but was able to kind of go in, do some almost code archaeology and find out what the game was about, kind of look at the elements of it, and then some really cool stuff. I heard him talk about it in a conference, and he was really, really amped up about it. And then we also have some intellectual property. Some many different aspects are in one selection. So in a game, you just don't have the game. The game might have music that belongs to a certain artist. You might have an engine like Unreal 4. That's all free now, but it wasn't free back then. Graphical art assets and art, and all that belongs to somebody. It doesn't become abandonware just because it goes out of print or goes out of sale. Every piece of a game belongs to somebody. So you always have to deal with that when you're trying to preserve something. And then the end product shouldn't be the only thing that's considered. So here are some institutions that I like to point out of people who are doing preservation right now. So we have the academic institutions. Stanford has a partnership with the University of California, Santa Cruz. They got a $500,000 grant from a museum and library sciences institute to create a standard to describe video games for researchers online. So not only are they going to write down the title and the characters and maybe what it's about, but how do you also describe the events of a video game? How do you describe, going, in Final Fantasy VII or whatever, how do you describe the beginning and the end and the middle somewhere? That's very challenging. That's why they got their $500,000. And it's an interesting project that I'm following along with. And you have the University of Texas. They have a video game archive. And the University of Michigan. They have a computer video game archive in Ann Arbor. Some of the museums, you have the National Museum of Computing in England, the Computer Game Museum in Berlin, and the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. They actually offer older video games for people to play and test and kind of look at if it's too fragile to touch or whatnot. And they have anything from the Magnavox all the way to current systems. And then you have archives, which really try to preserve the games so that they can be played later, but also they'll put stuff in the back corner for nobody to touch. But there are some interesting places in the US and in abroad. And then we also have individuals and collectors. So I would point out that individuals and collectors are probably the most unique and most important part of preservation, because you all preserve and keep your games for a specific reason. So all the video games are museums, archives, and academic institutions. They preserve games because they have historical value, or because they were the most sold copy, or because they represented something to the genre. Like Doom, we have Doom because it was arguably one of the first best FPS, although you can put Wolfenstein above it, but Doom created a lot of elements that are in a modern day FPS now. Or Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4 kicked off that era, or Ultima Online kicked off the MMORPGs, EverQuest, whatever. They preserve that. Now you might preserve something that has very niche value to you, very kitsch value. I have like a game called Magi Nation on the Game Boy that was arguably like a predecessor to what Yu-Gi-Oh is now. You played with guards, you summoned monsters, etc. I still have that game. I've never seen it around. It's preserved for me because I really enjoyed it as a kid and I spent way too many hours playing it. And it might be the same for you guys, where you preserve stuff because it has a sentimental value for you, and you're not going to find that in a museum. All right, I believe that is it.
And
SMC
the C also, if any of you are interested in kind of following along the topic of preserving video games, or just really any sort of, if you want to take some sort of action as far as online preservation, or just being more aware of kind of the issues facing you, especially with new technology today, I'd strongly recommend you check out the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org. And we also have the link here to the Internet Arcade from the Internet Archive, where you can try out some of these old classic arcade games. Any questions? Yeah. So,
Is it legal for any of those archival institutions to download and keep ROMs? I mean, you can find, for example, every Super Nintendo game ever on some shady server on the internet. But is it actually legal for any library to keep those same files?
I would say probably not, no. Yeah.
So you began the presentation asking why video games, and that kind of sounds like something that reviewers might be asking you on the topic if you're trying to publish in that area. So since games are obviously so pervasive, how do you convince reviewers or people who are in charge of dispensing the funds for this kind of archival work of their relevance? Is it still being trivialized, and have you seen in recent years, is it easier to make that argument for the importance of video game preservation?
Well, I would say, let me put it this way. When I have to make, say, a literature review or a pitch to a journal, or even to a group where I may be presenting, an academic sort of environment, it seems easier now. I need a smaller literature review, because most people, I think, at this point do understand, especially, and I think that may come from the prevalence of free-to-play gaming, as much as we kind of hate it. Now, everyone's mom, everyone's grandmother, they play some game on their phone, whether it's Angry Birds or anything like that. So gaming has really become even more mainstream now. So I think it's a little bit easier to relate the issue of, hey, you remember Flappy Bird? Hey, Mom, I know you really loved this game. They pulled it from the App Store because the developer just felt like taking it down or something like that. So I would say it's a little bit easier now to make that argument, especially with the growing body of research of, what games mean to people. And not only that, but what games can do for people. For about the past 10 or 15 years, there's been a serious academic push for studying how games actually help people learn. And I talked a little bit about the literacy aspects of video games, but it's being talked about not just in libraries, but in elementary schools, and even in the corporate world. If you need to train someone on a new skill that they're not too familiar with, if you use some of the theories of making game development to help people learn certain skills, they retain it better, and they have fun while doing it, which helps them, again, retain it. If you're trying to learn anything new and someone's just talking at you, it's a lot more passive. But if you can get someone interested, invested in learning something, whether it's through some quirky graphics, some repetitive, almost psychological feeding element, which a lot of free-to-play games do, it still makes them want to be a little bit more interested. Did I kind of answer that?
Sure, so built-in incentives in the games, and then also just the pervasiveness among cross-generations, that kind of stuff?
I do think so. Plus, the gaming industry is so huge now that I think it has made it a little bit easier. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, you have serious games, which are used in medical fields, simulations and whatnot. And then, when I was talking about all the assets of a video games are much more involved now. You can definitely put a human element, more so of a human element to them, because you can point out statistics like the current Fallout 4 series is going to have 13,000 lines of dialogue per person that they recorded. There are definitely industries based around voice acting, motion acting, for cinematics. And my mom is a theater professor, and I've been telling her you should get some of your students interested in voice acting and doing stuff like that if they can't make it on the theater grounds, or they interim jobs or whatnot, because that's a big industry. It's no longer people making games out of their garages. It's people putting millions of dollars into it. Some of these games have bigger budgets than most of your blockbuster movies. So it's it's a bigger cultural aspect now than it may have been 10 years ago, when I could say, I would like to do a paper on World of Warcraft, So, yeah.
Yes, sir.
So I have an interesting question. When it comes to getting primary sources, production materials, interviews with developers who might have slipped away from the industry, is it easier for academic groups to, or just general archival and historians to get access to those people, or is it, you say an experience is better if you're a journalist or if you're actually within the industry and you're just doing this as a hobby?
I think it's really just about initiative. I know the Video Game Archive in Austin, I believe they received many like production notes, diaries, journals related to some of the developers that work and live in Austin, whether that comes from donations or when it first sort of began, the archivist there seeking these people out and saying, hey, would you want to contribute these things? And that's kind of common in a lot of other archives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we get a lot of our sources from people who have already done it. So Anderson, that Ryan quoted, was a guy that just sent surveys to everybody. He says, I'm working with the Gamma Sutra, I liked your response. You can also maybe do like an oral history, but we haven't gotten to that point yet, to where you're just going to interview game developers. But I think it's, for a primary source, it's probably more, it's easier for people within the industry to interview people within the industry, because you're going to get a lot more, they're going to want to talk to somebody that's more familiar with them than, say, an academic professional. However, I will say that a guy from Stanford, Henry Lowood, which is the curator of their technical archive, that works on that $500,000 grant, speaks to IGDA, which is the International Game Developers Association, every year on gaming preservation. He goes and is like the face of the academic world for gaming preservation, and kind of adds his spin on it and says, this is why we need to get some preservation options into the game developing world. And so he's doing a lot of work with that, and I'm part of a list of academics that try to preserve their own collections, and then also try to work with archives to collect a lot of material. But it's difficult because you're coming from an academic side. A lot of game developers don't understand why they have to preserve their stuff, because new stuff just comes out all the time.
Is there a lame duck period where it's not economic or viable for a company to preserve all, if not most, of its production materials, source code, development documents, etc.? So, sure. In which they have to wait 10 or 20 years before they can say, this doesn't take much space on our hard drives. You don't have to spend money to get more hard drives to restore this and back it up.
Yeah.
So, is there a lame duck period?
And I mean, you'll never save everything. So, I used, like in 2013, Twitch produced 13 billion hours of video. You're never going to save any of that. I mean, it's just uneconomically feasible for you to save everything. And stuff, is lost to us now, or there's only 7 copies of a game out, or Little Samson. You'll never see that, unless you're willing to plop down $1,000 for it. I mean, stuff is just really rare, and sometimes you'll never save everything. So there's definitely a lame duck period for some of these, especially the independent developers who are, selling their houses to produce a game. It's hard for them. Yeah.
We just need to go ahead and start wrapping up for the next panel. So
Yep.
do 3 more questions.
Okay.
Sure. Yes, sir.
I am quite young, I'm like 15. I never quite understood why you would preserve games. Specifically, why we should make preservation a focus in the development process. Because in any other art form, the artist never really has to worry about how their game is going to be received later. They focus on making it, and then historians and preservers go after the fact. So why should we ask designers in the gaming industry, why should we treat them differently and ask them to make it a focus to preserve their games or make it preservable?
Well, I actually would say we don't necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily unique. Authors will keep multiple drafts of work. In fact, what's on the news right now, you're looking at Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. They're trying to pass it off as a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, when really it was a previously unreleased first draft. Why should they make an effort to preserve? Well, obviously, if you're a developer and your goal is developing a game, that's your goal. However, if you think of it as an artist and you're doing something, whether you're just wanting to create something for yourself or your friends to play, or you're going the much loftier goal of, I want to make a lot of money making a game everyone's going to love. Well, who's to say once you release that game, is that going to be it? Historians and archivists, things like that, we do go back and we do try to get that material because it may have some sort of cultural impact. And you're not necessarily going to know that at the time you're developing it, right? I mean, I don't really know how often someone says, I'm going to write the greatest novel ever, before they've even started, right? That comes much, much later. They may have no idea, and you hear about it all the time with sort of these low-key successes that just blow up overnight. Someone developed Flappy Bird, probably had no idea how big that was going to get. And I just use that as an example. It could be anything else. So I think just the step of talking about preservation more, making people aware of, when you save a file online or to the cloud, that's not ironclad. That's going to go away. And if we talk about it more and more and we follow the developments of preservation methods and organizations out there, maybe it becomes part of the conversation inherently. So when people talk about, oh, I'm making this game and I'm backing it up or preserving it with this, I mean, that's sort of like what I would love to see happen. But again, we're not going to save everything. And Matt, did you want to?
It's good. I will say that storage is cheap. I'm on a data management team also for tech, and you can put storage is really easy to get. We highlighted a lot of institutions of preservation here. Obviously, game developers have not been helping out, but some are. Not all game developers can or will or should maybe. I know that Nintendo and some of the bigger ones have definitely responded to that Anderson survey and said we are preserving our games, we're putting them into a mountain, we're putting them in climate controlled areas. Some people are very, they want their games to be preserved so that they can go back and remake them or have them for prosperity. So for why people should preserve it, I mean, it's up to them, really, I would say. And we're not necessarily advocating for everybody to start, put $10,000 in and preserve your games. We're just kind of outlining how archives and institutions and libraries and whatnot are attempting to preserve their games, but also that it is important to preserve, that we think that these are cultural artifacts that are important to society, that if they're not around anymore, then it would be a shame. So I think we're at time.
Yeah. We can get one more.
One more question.
Blue shirt.
So certain games like Warcraft 3, players could make custom maps like the original Dota, or Counter-Strike, players could make like VDOS, that sort of thing. Is there any place for people that still have those files, if they had to download and play them, to submit them to some sort of other service to archive them? I could bid the original version of Dota today and play Warcraft 3, but I don't think that's that file. Did you guys hear that?
I think the question was if you did have original files, what could...
I would put them to the, yeah. Internet Archive would probably take your stuff in a heartbeat. I mean, they would take petabytes worth of information if you had it, and they would just archive it. They might not put it up online right now, but they'll keep it for you. So you just get in touch with Jason Scott at the Internet Archive, and he'll take pretty much anything you want. So.
I noticed that most communities that preserve their, for example, the Quake community preserves most of their maps, quads, and mods, and they've done a good job doing that alone, but they don't have any organization to do that for them. And I don't even know how many of those maps have been submitted to the Internet Archive. Would the University of Texas Tech allocate space for archiving fan content in the future?
I think some of the institutions that I put up there would. Tech isn't really looking at that right now. Maybe we can change yeah, no pressure. When we can change the administration's mind and give us more funding for that, maybe.
If
But
anyone knows wealthy donors, I mean, that would help the conversation
yeah.
along.
Anyone want to cut us a check? All right.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming and listening to us. If you have any other questions or want to get in touch with us, I have some cards up here. Matt didn't bring any because they usually don't let him out of the basement.
That's true. That's true.